So welcome. Hi, my name is Alex Riviere. I am the Atlanta Vue.js meetup organizer. We do have a meetup here in town for those of you who are local. We're going to hopefully start up meetups again next year. We have a lovely little schedule. A bunch of the JavaScript meetups in town are all organizing together, so we're like sharing resources to find spaces and speakers and stuff like that. And so hopefully we'll start having meetups again next year, but that is why I am here. The previously scheduled speaker unfortunately had to step out, so I am stepping in last minute. So if this feels very slapdash, it is. I am also a handwritten font connoisseur. You may notice the very professional fonts that I use in my slides. The header in this is Chantel Sans, which is a lovely variable font. It has many axes that you can do with bounce and informality and stuff. It's fantastic. And then the other one is Comic Noi, which is a newer version of Comic Sans that looks a little bit cleaner, a little bit more professional. So you'll be seeing those throughout this talk. So we're going to learn about Vue today, and as I mentioned previously, we're going to be talking about Vue 3. So when we talk about Vue, there's sort of the classic way of writing a Vue component that we call the Options API. With the Options API, you define all your data in one place, you define all your methods in one place, you define computed values in one place, you define, you really split things out. We're not going to do that. I'm ignoring that API completely. It is still a perfectly valid API if you have stuff written that way. Should still work for the most part, maybe a couple of changes that you have to make. But in general, that method still works. There's nothing wrong with that method. And if you want to use that method, go for it. What we're going to talk about today, though, is the composition API, which is the new thing in Vue 3. It's the thing that really upset a whole bunch of people. You can use the composition API and the Options API in tandem. You can use them together. They are not exclusive. You can make a component with a setup method and have all your other stuff too. So that is an option. I'm just letting you all know this is not the one true way. Everybody has their own way of doing things, and I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that I'm not saying that you have to do things this way. I'm showing you a couple of different ways to do things. So first we're going to talk about First, we're going to talk about reactive values. In Vue 2 previously, for those of you who use Vue 2, they were using object.define property to define a getter and a setter on an object to track the reactivity, which is a very fancy way of saying when you get a value, it would track the function that called it, and anytime that you set the value, it would then call that function again, okay? And so we have a render function. When the render function accesses the getter, we would then, when you update the setter, it would then call that render function again. And this is great. This is how Vue 2 works. Works great, works fantastic, works with Internet Explorer, fine. With newer versions of JavaScript, ES 2015 and newer, I don't actually know when proxies came around, but I think they were ES 6. The Vue core team decided to move to using proxies. Now, proxies, you cannot backfill. You cannot make a polyfill for them in Internet Explorer. It is a breaking change. It will not support older browsers. But the way that it works is that it will wrap an object and then listen for get calls and set calls, and if you're using a method, it'll be able to listen for that, etc. Right? It has a lot more options of how to do stuff within the reactive things. There's a lot of caveats in Vue 2 of if you're working with an array, sometimes you have to use this $set and set a value because you can't actually track that with reactivity. That problem is now gone in Vue 3. So all of that is to say, the sort of two basic building blocks of Vue reactivity are ref and reactive. So we'll talk about ref first. Ref is basically an object with one property. So anytime that we're tracking a value in Vue, it has to be on an object because we need something that we can wrap. So for instance, if you're wanting to track a string, you have to make the string be a value of a property on an object. Always. You can't just have a string be reactive. So ref sort of solves that. Anytime that you have a ref, it is going to be, name of ref dot value, and that will give you the value and let you set the value. It is good for tracking simple values such as numbers, strings, booleans, but you can also use this to track objects and arrays and more complex things as well. It doesn't prohibit that. It's just you're going to have an extra property that you have to go through to get to things. The other sort of basic building block of Vue is reactive. So a reactive object has to be a complex value. So it can't be a string. It can't be a number. It can't be a Boolean. It has to be something like an array or an object. So it's only good for tracking those complex values. And why that's good is because if you want to not have to do mydata.value.thing, you just want to do mydata.thing, you can do that, right? So that's where reactive objects are really good, is that if you have an object, you can just make it reactive and you're not going to have to attempt to remember oh, I have to do dot value to get this property or whatever. So let's write some code. Like I said, this is a very impromptu talk. So we're going to go down here and go over to my code page. So this first example that we're going to do is going to be in an HTML file. Because one of the things about Vue that I want to explain that really upsets people sometimes when we talk about Vue and about its templating language is that they're like, why don't you just use JSX? Why do we have to use quotes? Why can't we use curly brackets everywhere? Right? I've heard a lot of that. The reason for that is that the Vue compiler, the template compiler, is designed to run in the browser. You do not need a build step to use Vue. I'm going to say that again so that it really sinks in. You don't need a build step to use Vue. You can just plop it into a browser and it'll work, and you have the full templating syntax available to you. Okay? Everybody get that? And I need you to remember that as we're talking about things and why we're not using curly brackets for everything. Okay? So this is sort of our very simple, minimal example, right? Hello world, first thing that you do all the time. And what we're going to do is that we've got our create app, which just allows us to create a Vue application. And we're going to define a setup function. We're going to pass it an object with a setup function. So this is the basis of the context, of the composition API, is you give it a setup function, and you can do everything that you need to do to set up your component within the setup function, right? So we're going to define a ref. Remember, it's an object with a dot value on it, and we're going to say that is equal to hello world. So ref.value is now equal to hello world. And then I'm going to return message, so our ref that we've just made, from our setup function. So anything that you return from your setup function in an object is available to you within the template, right? So within the template compiler, it now knows, oh, here are all the things that I have available to me. If you attempt to reference something that's on window while you're in the template compiler, you're going to get a big old error, and it's going to be like, I don't know what that is, okay? So, but if you return it, if you add it into the thing that you're returning from your setup function, it is suddenly available. And then we're going to define our template. So here's our template. It's inside of a string, and it's just an h1, and it's referencing message. Now you'll notice that with the ref, we should be using dot value. The template compiler knows that it's a ref, so we don't have to use dot value, except in weird certain cases, which is why I don't like using refs. Or I don't like writing functions inside of templates, and we'll get into that later probably. But the templating syntax allows you to simply say, here's the value, it's a ref, you figure out what to do with it, and it'll be like, cool. Great. So when I say that we can use this in HTML, in just straight up HTML, the other way that you can do this is that you can actually make a template element and give it a ID, and we're going to call it app template, right? And you can put all of your code that you want to use into your template. And then you can actually just give it a selector and say, hey, actually go get app template. And it will still work, right? So now our template is actually in an HTML element. And that gives you all of the like hinting and linting and all of the fancy good stuff of writing HTML. It also allows you, if you're writing like PHP, or if you're writing Java, or one of those other backend languages that has its own templating thing, you can like make little like HTML snippets that are the template of your component and then have some JavaScript with it and make them all connect to each other. So this is an option. If you are doing a build of Vue, this is not available to you. The compiler gets compiled out when you do a built version. You have to specify within your build options that you want the version that has the template compiler. Otherwise, by default, when you have a build step, the compiler gets removed, right? What else was I wanting to cover? I'm going to go up to my slides really quick. Right, okay, so within this template, as you can see, I'm using this double curly bracket expression. So anytime that you want to interpolate a value as text inside of something, this is how you do it, right? Is just double curly bracket. What's really great about this is that it automatically figures out like, hey, if this is an object, just JSON stringify it and then dump that, right? So if you put it inside of a pre-tag, it's already formatted, so it's got all the like tabbing and everything that you want. It looks really nice. So debugging stuff in Vue is great because you're just like, here's an object. What does that look like? And it'll be like, oh, here you go. The other thing that we want to do, though, is that maybe we want to have some form of dynamic value, right? So like I have message in there, but let's say that we want to be able to make it be somebody's name, right? So if we change our template so that it says like hello, and then we'll put a little exclamation mark, and it's going to get real confused for a second. Super excited to see us by saying hello twice. What we'll do is that we'll also put in a label, and that's going to be for name. And then we're going to have an input, and it's going to be name, type text. And then name, and ID is going to be name. All right, cool. And now we're going to have an input here. Great. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bind the value of message to this input. All right. So in Vue, when you want to bind an attribute, there's a directive called v-bind. And we're going to bind it to our value attribute. And we're going to say, hey, make that be, ooh, man, lost my train of thought there, message. Great. So now we've got a lovely little input inside of our label. And we're going to say this is name. We actually have proper semantics there. Great. So now we can see that the value of hello world is bound to this input, right? Great. Here's the thing, though. We've only done it one direction. If I change this input, nothing happens, right? So what we need to do here is that we need to listen for an input event, I think. Input event? I'm checking David for... Yeah, I'm getting there. But input event, I'm doing event handlers first. Change, we'll do change. All right. So what we're going to do is that we're going to add an event handler for change. which is going to be v_on. So v_on is another directive that allows you to add an event handler for the named event that you want to. So we're going to say v_on, and we're going to do change, I think. And we're going to say, handle message update. Now, it's going to freak out about this because I have not defined handle message update. So we're going to go define handle message update really fast. And this is the part where I was talking about if you're trying to do this assignment within the templating language, it gets weird as to whether or not you need to refer to the dot value on a ref. So rather than trying to do this function assignment within the template, we're going to write the function in the JavaScript section because it's a function, and that's where functions go. So we're going to create a const handle message update, and we're going to get a value, I think. I'm probably doing this wrong. And nope, that needs to equal. Right, because I did const, we have to do the arrow bracket thingy. All right, cool. And then we're going to do message dot value equals value. Ta-da! Look at that. It's beautiful. And then we're going to do handle message update. And my linter is like screaming at me right now. All right. Yeah, yes. Don't worry about it. All right. Cool. So we now have this. And in theory, nope, that was not it. This is what happens when you do this live. I think it's input. I think we have to do, I think that this is actually an event, a proper event. So we're going to do e.target.value. Cool. So in theory now, yeah, there we go. Yay, amazing. All right, cool. So anyway, that's a lot, right? So that's a lot to write on every single input that you want to do this to. So one of the things that they thought, people are going to be writing a lot of event handlers, so let's make a shorthand for that. So let's shorten this a little bit, and we'll put @. So when you see the @ symbol in Vue, that means it's an event handler, right? So @input means you are listening for an input event. With the value, we have a similar thing. They were like, people are going to be binding a lot of values. Rather than having to type vbind everywhere, how about we just put : So there we go. Now it is shorter, right? This is the shorthand for v_on and vbind. So anywhere that you see the @ symbol, it is v_on. It's the v_on directive. Anywhere that you see just a colon in front of an attribute name, it is the vbind directive. But the Vue core team was like, this is actually still too much. We're having to write a whole function. We're having to do, this is an input. We know what to do with inputs. Why don't we just make a thing that does that? So they made a thing called v-model. And we can get rid of that. And v-model allows you to say, hey, I have a reactive value. You know that this is an input, and you can figure out what type of input it is. Do the correct thing, and when this input updates, however it updates, go ahead and update the value of the thing that I'm giving you. So for instance, on a checkbox, it's not listening for an input, it's looking for a checked event. On a select, it's not looking for the way that you interact with it. It changes depending on, and Vue just figures that out. It's like, I got you, don't worry about it.
I was looking at those ones are the change ones.
Those are the change ones. The select is the change one. Thank you, okay. So with that, we now don't need to actually write this method, right? We don't need that method. We don't need this. We can get rid of that. And there we go. We've got it'll now work the way that we want it to. And so we can go back, we can do this again. Boo, look at that. We've super condensed that code. What's great about vModel too is that when you define a component, you can actually use vModel on components as well. Within a component, the component, if you define a prop on a component, which we'll get to in a bit, if you define a prop on a component called model value, model capital V value, and you define an event called update colon model capital V value, and you emit that event up, and you receive a prop, you can do vModel thing, and it will automatically synchronize stuff for you, and you don't have to write the handler. But simultaneously, you can also split it up if you're wanting to do more complex logic, right? Like maybe you want to convert things to a number. There's a shorthand for that. All sorts of stuff like that you can just do. So that is the short version of being able to write Vue. This is sort of the basic beginning intro to writing Vue stuff in the browser. And so part of the reason why we're also having to do like dashes and stuff in places, this ties back to like why the templating language looks the way that it does. Rather than having like camel case stuff in the browser, anytime that you have a prop that is camel case that you define, when you use it as a prop on a component or an element or anything like that, particularly, specifically, when you are in a browser, you need to make it kebab case, which is the dashes between words instead of a capitalized letter. The reason for that is when you are in a browser and you attempt to read all the attributes of an element within the browser, it will turn them all, I believe, uppercase or lowercase. So you can't tell if it's all one word. So the kebab case is there for the Vue compiler to know, oh, this is actually going to be a prop that is camel case. Make sense? Cool. So when you complain about that later, that you're like, this is weird and I don't like writing it because it's not the same, it is the same. You have to do like some stuff with that in your head. Cool. All right. So this is the basic one. So let's go back to our slides here, and we're going to do a review. Make sure that I didn't forget anything because I wrote out things that I wanted to cover. So Vue can be used without a build step. I think I covered that pretty heavily, and I think I covered it twice. Vue can be used without a build step. You can just do it in HTML. It's super great. Can you do that with React? Can you do that with Svelte? You can do that with Vue, though. I'm very cocky about that one. I get irrationally upset about that one when people complain about it. So reactive values are tracked automatically. When you get a value from a reactive value, it tracks the function that called it. When you set a value, it then calls every single function that ever called it, basically. So it's able to track all of those things. It also knows when to track something and when not to track something. So it's super handy like that. It's great. I love it. All right, cool. Double curly brackets allow us to use values as text. These will be put in as text if you get some HTML from somewhere else, like if you're pulling HTML from an API or something like that, and you try to just like put it in the middle, not gonna work. For that type of thing, what you'll want to do is that you'll want to make a surrounding element and then use the v-html directive. And you can pass it a value that is HTML, and it will set it as inner HTML, I believe. It's the equivalent of React's like inner HTML or dangerously set inner HTML. We just don't call it dangerous. So probably should. That's the one thing in React that I do like. I'm like, that's a good naming convention because you really shouldn't do that. vbind / is a directive used to bind values to an attribute. von, or the @ is a directive used to listen to events. And vmodel is a directive that binds a value and an event listener for updates. So we're able to do 2 for 1, right? Super great. Everybody loves a buy one, get one free. So it's a super good thing. So now we're going to move on to single file components. So far we've been working in an HTML file, but y'all are here because we're talking about front-end frameworks, y'all probably have a build step. You're probably looking like, okay, how do I get Vue into a build step? How do I do this? Now, I'm not going to cover how to create a Vue project. There are other guides out there to do that. Generally speaking, though, you want to just go get Vite and then say make a new Vue project, set some settings as it asks you, and then boom, you're done. You have a Vue project. There's also Nuxt if you're needing a backend framework. There's also Astro, which some people are using and I love. It's great. My blog runs on it. So let's talk about single file components. Now, part of the reason why, I need to go down here. Part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you about the fact that we can write things in HTML and you can take your template and put it in a template tag is that now that we know that we can have our script in a script tag and our template in a template tag, the following is going to look real familiar. So let's pop open our very handy app.vue. So first off, we're going to have our application creation here in our main.js. So our HTML is going to import our main.js. We're going to import create app from Vue. We're going to import our app component into our main.js. And then we're going to say, here's the component that I want you to use. And then here's where I want you to mount it. So I'm saying mount to a thing that's going to have an ID of app. And here's the thing I want you to mount. That's it. So that's all the main.js file is. This is the equivalent of like react.createL or whatever it is, like react.mount, react DOM, whatever. It's a magical incantation that I can never remember in React. So this is our app.vue file. And like I said, this is going to look really familiar, right? We have a script section, we have a template section, and we have a style section. And you'll notice that I put the template below the script because that is the correct way to do things. And if anybody tells you otherwise, they are wrong, and I will fight them. They can come see me, I will fight them. And specifically what we're going to be using here in our single file components is script setup. So you'll notice that it has this setup attribute. What this does is that this does some magical compiler time tomfoolery and figures out like, oh, you have an import, that goes here. Oh, you're writing a ref, great, that goes inside of a setup function, right? And so the compiler figures out like where it needs to put things. The reason why I want to show you script setup is that in coming months, hopefully, there is a new feature that Vue is releasing called Vapor Mode, where the rendering engine is going to be a lot faster. Is the easiest way to explain it without going into super like internals of how Vue works talk. Vapor Mode will be like significantly faster, but at first I believe the only way that you will be able to use it is with the script setup tag. I believe that they are going to work on getting more support for other methods over time, but initially, like because they're already doing like compiler magic with script setup, they're just going to leave it there. So when I say that this is like a magic compiler thing, it's gonna, if any of you have done Svelte, you're gonna feel real at home here. So for instance, we want to make some sort of reactive value that we can track. So we're gonna make a to-do list. I've made this to-do list. If you go see my other talk today, Vue for React Devs, it's basically gonna be the same thing. We're just gonna use that, right? So what we need to track in our application are two values. I need to track an array of to-do items, and I need to track a, my brain just stopped for a second, and I need to track whether or not we're showing archived items, right? So once you're done with an item and you check it and you're like, yep, done, right? I need a way to be able to say, okay, cool, you're done with that, stop showing it. But then I want to be able to review the ones that I've done, so I need a toggle switch to be able to do that. Cool. So we're going to import some stuff from Vue. So I'm going to do import reactive. And I'm going to import ref from view. Great. Ta-da. Brilliant. And then I'm going to say, hey, we're going to have to-dos. And that's going to equal reactive array. Done. Boom. And we're going to do const show archive. And it is going to be a ref that equals false. So remember, we can track Boolean values with ref. We can track complex objects, such as arrays, with reactive. So now I can interact with this array as though it's just an array. So for instance, if I want to add something to it and just push it on, done. So the next thing that we want to do, all of these in our script setup as well, we're going to be able to put out. It automatically adds them into the template engine, so you have these available to you. You don't have to like return anything or export anything. It just knows like, oh, you have these values available. Great, go use them. The next thing that I want to do is that I want to create a method called const add to do. And that is going to take, we'll say that takes an event. And that event, right, I keep on wanting this to be like function, and I'm not. So that event is going to actually be a form submit event. Because when we add it to do, I'm going to put it inside of a form. And then when that form submits, I'm going to just get the value that I need. So we'll do const form data. And for those of you who don't know about form data is amazing and will change your life. Form data, and then I'm going to do event.target. Great. Cool. I do have a TypeScript thing, and so it's going to be like super angry that I'm like making things happen with it, but it's fine. And then what we're going to do is that we're going to say, hey, to-dos. We're going to push on a new object. And within that object, it's going to have an ID, which we're going to use window.crypto.randomuid, which once again, another great function that exists. I believe that's right. TypeScript. Well, that's exciting. Cool. So yeah, random UID. Oh, you're right. That needs to be that. Okay, cool. And then we're going to have our so I need a unique ID for each of these as we loop over it, similar to React and then probably Angular. When you're looping over something and creating DOM elements, you need to define a unique key for each thing. You can't just use the index. It gets really weird when you start doing that and try to like move things around. So we're defining a unique ID value so that it can track that DOM element. We're going to say that the to-do item is going to be, actually we'll just do value, right? And that's going to be our form data, data.get.to-do. And we're going to have an input called to-do. And then, every frickin' time I'm going to do that. And then we also want to have a value that tracks whether or not this to-do item is done. So we're going to have archive. We're going to say false. Great. And there we go. So now we have an add to-do function. So in our template now, I can start listing some stuff. So let's do this. We're going to make a list here, and we're going to have an li that is going to have a v4. So v4 is a directive that allows us to iterate over objects or arrays and get their value and their key. So if you have an object, you can get value comma key from it. If you have an array, you can get value comma index, right? We only need the value of the thing. I don't need the index of it. So we're going to say to do for to do in to dos. And that will allow us to do something like key equals to do dot ID. And then we can list our to do, which we're going to do dot value. Right? So, as you can see, nothing shows up because we have no to-dos in the list. So we now need a form that allows us to add new to-dos to the list. So let's make that. Actually, I'm going to add one more thing to the end of this one. We're going to do e.target.reset. And that'll make sense in a minute. All right. So we're going to make a form. For those of you who come from React, form is an HTML element that allows you to do things, and you can listen to a submit event and catch it and do things, and it works with any of the things, and you don't have to bind values to every single input. Super handy. And we're going to say it'll be a get, and we'll do a, because we don't actually care, and then we're going to do @submit. And with our submit event, Vue has, once again, made some things that make our life easier. We know that we're getting an event object, so we can just do .prevent. And now we don't have to call event.prevent default as soon as we get into our function. It'll just automatically do it. It knows when this has a submit event, just prevent it. We don't have to add in that stuff. And then I'm going to say add to do. So now when we submit, it will call the add to do option. And I'm going to create a label here. And label is going to be for to do. And we're going to have an input. We're going to say to do. New to do. We're going to have an input. And it's going to be of type text. And it's going to have a name of to do. And an ID of to do. So the ID is for the label. The name is for the form data, right? So we can find it again later. Don't care. All right. And then that's it. I'm not having to bind a value to this input because we don't actually care about it. And then the last thing that we're going to do is that we're going to also get out of this label. And we're going to make a button. So buttons by default are of type submit. So for those of you who aren't aware, if you are in a form and you have a button of type submit, regardless of where you place it in the form, it will submit the form. So if you want a button in a form that doesn't actually submit the form, set it to type button. Ran into that with a code base recently. It was very fun to fix. But we actually want this one to submit. So we're going to say add new. Great. Save that. Great. OK, cool. So now we have new to do. I can type in like make cake. There we go. We've added it to our list. Woo! Super exciting. Look at that. All right. Now, I need to be able to have a checkbox that we toggle for whether or not we want to archive or unarchive a thing. So we should do that next. We're going to make an input here. Input, and it's going to be type checkbox. And we're going to, don't care. I know I'm supposed to have an ID. We're not going to because I am a terrible person. And we're going to have it be, I'm just awful. I'm doing things in a terrible way. Don't do this. This is very inaccessible. Sorry to all of my friends who are accessibility people. Sorry, Todd. We're going to vModel our to-do dot archive. Okay. So now I have a checkbox. And when I check that checkbox, it is now archived. But it's still showing up. Well, the reason that it's still showing up is because we aren't filtering out the archived ones, right? So we're going to bring in a new tool. Here's a fun tool. In other templating languages, I believe most of the time you would like put a watcher or like a use effect or something, and you'd be like, look for this thing. When this thing updates, create this other value, like update this other value, right? In Vue, we have this lovely thing called computed. So what computed does is that computed will cache a value. And so you can sort of toggle, you can make filters and stuff like that. You can make complex queries and do things based on the current reactive state of a thing, and it'll have different values. But that value is memoized, right? It's cached. So if you're toggling on a Boolean or something, it will run the function the first time, and then the second time it won't, if that makes sense, right? It's based on all of the things that it's going against. Similarly, if you have like a string, right, and you update that string and you want it to call a URL, do not do that inside of a computed value, because if you make that string be the same string again, the function won't run. It'll just pull the cached value, okay? So computed values, great for things where you're needing to compute a value, bad for things where you're needing to go like do an asynchronous action to fetch something or make something that can't be, that may change at any given time. So we're gonna make a new computed value. So computed at the end of the day ends up looking like a ref, but it's not a ref, it's computed. And so we're gonna say const filtered to-dos equals computed. Cool. And so we're going to pass it a function. From that function, what we're going to do is that we're going to return to-dos dot filter. And we're going to take the element that we're on, and we're going to say, hey, if el dot archive, equals show archived dot value, right? So we're using that show archive now, right, which is set to false currently. So if show archive dot value is equal to archive, right? So when it's false, we'll show the not archived ones, and if it is true, we will show the archived ones. There we go. So now within our template, we can simply do filtered to-dos. Great. So that one we can, well, actually, it would probably just disappeared, but we can be like, hey, make more cake, right? And then when I check it, boom, disappears. Great. But now we need to be able to see things that are filtered, right? Okay. Making me work for it. All right, so let's do another input here. We're going to do another checkbox here. We're going to actually put this one in a label. Label for show archive. And we're going to say input, we're going to say show archive. Actually, we want to do the input here. Type checkbox. And then we're going to vmodel this one to show archived. Boom, done. All right, so now if I click that, you can see it has the ones that we've archived, right? Which is great. Now, once I've archived something though, I don't want it to have the checkbox. I don't want to be able to unarchive things because I am a perfectionist and I do things right the first time and I never have to unarchive anything. So what we're going to do is that we are going to add a new directive to this input here. This input is going to get a directive called vif. And what vif does, can anybody guess what vif does? Yeah, no idea. It's an if statement. Oh, yeah. So vif, not show archived, right? So only if we're not showing archived ones do we want to show this checkbox. And now the checkbox doesn't show up when we are showing archived ones, but when we are showing When we are showing the ones that we still have to do, it'll show the checkbox, and when we are showing the archived ones, it will show no checkbox. So vif is a directive that allows you to do that. It has 2 accompanying directives that you can use with it. One is v else if. Anybody guess what that does? Oh yeah, it's an else if, very good. And then the other one is v else, which is an else statement. So you can write complex logic of being able to show things or not show things. Vif specifically removes elements from the DOM if the statement is false, right? There is another directive called vshow. Vshow hides elements from in the DOM when the statement is false. So it just simply does not display them. They will still be there. So if you're having a thing where you're like, I need a reference to this element, which is more complex than we're dealing with right now, but if you need a reference to an element, and you always need a reference to that element, whether or not it's supposed to be showing at the moment, you want to use vshow, not vif, because vif will remove that element from the DOM. So, I think I've done everything that I was going to do. Any questions? Have I covered things thoroughly? Do you feel like you've gained knowledge? Cool. All right. We're going to... Nope. I'm going to go back. So, we're going to review, make sure that I didn't miss anything. Script setup is a fancy compiler directive that creates a setup function for you, right? You're not having to write export default curly bracket setup parentheses, right? You just write stuff and things happen and it's great. Computed allows us to make complex logic stored as a single ref. So remember, so if we were to use that filtered to-do item like in the script section, we would need to do filtered to-dos dot value to get the value off of it. We have vif, velse, and velsif and velse, and those are directives that are essentially an if-else, else-if-else statement, rather than using like complex, weird ternary options to be like either null or like either this or null, right? We don't need to do that. We have a way to do that in Vue. And v4 is a directive that allows us to loop over arrays and objects. That is all that I have. Thank you very much. Once again, here's the QR code. I will be pushing the changes that I've made to this GitHub repo right after this talk. Yeah, that is all that I have. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody want me to go over anything? Yes?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how you could have it in the HTML, or you could have like a more complex setup. Is there sort of like a line where you'd want to use one over the other, or maybe some use cases that you could just talk about?
So the question is there a line where you would rather have a build step, you want a build step rather than having it in just HTML? There is, and you will know it when you hit it. I don't have a good, like when you start getting into, I need 30 components, right? I didn't really go over importing components, but I mean, I could probably cover that really quickly. But like once you start getting into like, I need 30 components within this one component, and so I'm having to like put in a bunch of like extra HTML and script tags on the page, you might want to build step at that point. The using it in the browser is sort of the good starting, like launching point for like, oh, I have a JSON blob and I want to dynamically filter it with Vue in the browser, right? It's good for that, right? But if you're getting into complex, like my entire page is JavaScript, you probably want to build step at that point. It's when you have other things that are not JavaScript on the page that you may or may not need a build step. Cool. Any other questions? All right. Somebody was wanting me to cover ways of passing state. Yes. So we're gonna talk through that really fast. I can show you some stuff but this won't be covered in any of the links that I've given you. Or it will. The Vue docs has most of this. So there are a multitude of ways of passing state between components. The first and primary one that you should always default to is props and emit. So on a component, you can define props. Within script setup, you would use the define props compiler macro, which it looks like a function. You pass it an object, and you say define props, and you give it a list of props that you want to define, right? And then the compiler does magic things and puts it in the right place. The other thing that you want to do, especially specifically in Vue 3, is that you want to define emits as well. There's an emits option which allows you to define the events that this component will emit up. If you don't define the emit, it will not go. It won't happen. So that's why we need to make sure that you define them. So typically the way that you would traditionally pass it is that you do props down, so you pass the value down with a prop, and then when you change it, you emit an event up so that the component that's ingesting this other component can catch the change, right? So that's where vModel comes in. You're able to define model value and update model value as an event. However, in Vue 3, unlike Vue 2, which this is a good one, in Vue 2, it used to be that you would do vbind prop name dot sync, and then it would listen for an update prop name. In Vue 3, they were like, that's a really stupid convention. So they changed it. So now it's v-model prop name, and it'll do the automatic syncing as long as you're emitting an update prop name event. So that's sort of the traditional props down, emit up. Another way of doing it, my personal thing, is if you have components that are coupled but you don't want to have to prop drill and pass things all the way through, we have what is called provide and inject, which is equivalent to React's context API. You provide a value from a parent, and any child element of that can inject the value. And that allows you to say, okay, I'm defining a thing up here in this. Something beneath me is going to need it, and any child of that can then use that value. And you can pass values, you can pass methods, you can pass whatever, and it'll use it. I'm about to go over. The other one that you can use is, and this is where we start getting into risky territory. You can just define a ref out in space and then pull it into multiple components. I don't advise it. You can, though. It does work. That is sort of the simple version of shared global state. That gets very messy very quickly, and there are some caveats to that where something may not end up listening to that reactive value. It doesn't happen very often, but it can. You might hit a weird edge case of that, which is why typically when you're wanting to go into global state territory, the two main packages that the Vue world recommends are either Vuex, which is the old style, Redux style, but it's better than Redux style, global state management. You have actions, you have mutations, you have getters, you have setters, right? Or you have getters and you have state, or whatever they call it. So that's sort of the old school style where it's you call dispatch this action, and then that commits a mutation, and it does that whole process. But the newer version of that is sort of being more recommended, especially when you're dealing with composition API, is the package called Pinya, which is sort of the next gen version of Vuex. And the way that you define a Pinya store is wildly different from Vuex. You can basically define essentially a setup function, do all the things that you do in a composition, and then return that object, and that is now a global state object. And you can then use it within whatever component you need to. So Pinya is that one. Vuex is the other one that's really good. And so those are sort of the five-ish main ways of doing stuff. There's other things that you can do. You can have like an event bus. Don't recommend it. You can, there's lots of different ways that you can pass state around, but those are sort of the 4 primary ways of doing it. And a lot of that type of documentation is linked to in the Vue docs. There we go. That's the word. Cool. Does that help with the ways of passing state around? Cool. Anybody else have any other questions? Fantastic. I hope you got something out of this. And thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to my talk. And I hope you have a great rest of your conference. And if you know React, you should come see my talk on Vue for React Devs, where I will have stickers.